Yo, you remember the good old days, man? Back at school, the best days of our lives, man. No work, no stress, no pressure, not a care in the world. You remember them days, man? Yeah, me neither. People always criticise schools, it seems, saying they don't equip kids with the tools they need. But personally, I think that's ridiculous, cause I learned loads, it's just that none of it was on the curriculum. On my very first day I got a lesson in textiles. If you wore the wrong ones, then you were exiled. In my school, if you didn't have a pair of kickers, you might as well have turned up in a tattered pair of slippers. But it wasn't just what you wore, it's how you wore it. Rucksacks with one strap were mandatory, and having a piercing in your left ear was okay, but not the right, cause that clearly meant you were gay. All I wanted was acceptance and to make some friends. When the bowl haircut was the latest trend, my mum wouldn't let me have it, and she'd say to me, son, you're gonna thank me one day, and that day has come. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed. I learned more about social studies in recess, and from some fuddy-duddy in a tie and a tweed vest, I learned that the door to popularity had two keys. One was brute force, the other was beauty. I learned that the way to gain approval from the group came from being mean to people lower than you in the food chain. And much to my own shame and disappointment, I made the simple choice: if you can't beat them, join them. Back when I and Mike was biting Holyfield's ear off, we were arguing over who the hardest kid in the year was. But it was plain to all from the bus ride home, whoever sat on the back seat occupied the throne. But occasionally a challenger would step in the ring with the intention of usurping the king. The only thing that we didn't seem to learn was 200 kids chanting always led to fights getting broken up before they started. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed. I didn't learn about sex in a biology lab. Most of my knowledge came from a pornography mag, back when random boners were a constant fear.
Would you like to come to the front?
No, really, I'm cool here. And as if puberty wasn't hard enough to manage, I got my first taste of heartache and anguish. My first relationship lasted 2 days, and it's still one of my top 5 most painful breakups to date. All the hotter girls dated older guys who could already drive, and I swear we're like 25. I couldn't wait to be as old as these people, but now I look back like, was that shit even legal? But all in all it wasn't so bad, apart from the slang and the vocab, the hair and the clothes fads, the pressure, the smoke bags, the fights and the romance. In fact, screw that place, I never wanna go back. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed. Sometimes I take a trip down memory lane. Before we all had jobs and bills to pay, I sit back and reminisce about the good old days, but most of the time I thank God it's changed.